Allies become enemies in Yemen's war. The United Arab Emirates accused of bombing Saudi-backed government troops to help separatists in the south. Can the coalition between the two Gulf nations survive such a rift? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. Now, a split is threatening the Saudi Emirati coalition fighting the war in Yemen. The two Gulf allies are supposed to be on the same side, but the UAE is accused of attacking the government that the coalition is trying to restore. Yemen's internationally recognized president says UAE warplanes bombed government troops around Aden. Separatists trained by the Emiratis had taken over the southern city. The Yemeni government is urging Saudi Arabia and the United Nations to intervene. But the UAE says it only targeted what it calls terrorists. Alexia O'Brien has more.
This is said to be the aftermath of Emirati airstrikes in Aden. Yemen's internationally recognised government is furious the UAE bombed its positions, allowing separatists to retake territory they'd lost to Saudi-backed government forces 24 hours earlier. Both sides pulling in reinforcements to battle over a divided southern city in a country fractured by years of war.
All Aden governorates are safe. Now we're dealing with some pockets and terrorist hideouts, which are sadly involved with what is called the legal government.
Yemen's government condemned the UAE bombing of its forces, saying it had caused hundreds of deaths and injuries. In a statement, its defence ministry said it held the Emirates responsible for what it called a blatant aggression. And President Abd Rabbu Mansour Hadi's urged Saudi Arabia to intervene. Separatists from the Southern Transitional Council are part of the Saudi Emirati coalition that's fighting Houthi rebels. Less than 3 weeks ago, they took over the city of Aden, the seat of the Saudi-backed, internationally recognised Yemeni government. On Wednesday, government forces took the nearby coastal town of Zinjibar before pushing into Aden. On Thursday, though, they withdrew again. President Hadi said it was to spare the city and its people.
The situation's good and the troops' morale is high. We're heading to Abyan and Shabwa and we will free every inch of the southern territory.
The violence has exposed an apparent rift in the Saudi-UAE coalition, with each country backing opposing sides in southern Yemen, which was a separate country until 1990.
The Saudis and Emiratis are divided on these issues because from a Saudi perspective, what they had always wanted is to ensure that the Houthis are not a threat that can operate across the border and launch attacks, whether it's rocket attacks or drone attacks into Saudi Arabia. What the United Arab Emirates wants to do instead, of course, is to establish an independent southern state. And these two objectives do not align.
The Yemeni government's asked for the United Nations to meet on the Emirati strikes. 60,000 people have left the city, but tens of thousands remain in harm's way as the fighting intensifies. Alexia O'Brien, Al Jazeera.
Let's bring in our panel into the show now. Joining us from New York City, Alkhadher Sulaiman, Director of the Office of Foreign Affairs for the Southern Transitional Council in New York City. From Amman, Hassan Barari, Professor of International Relations at the University of Jordan. And from London, also on Skype, is Elizabeth Kendall, Senior Research Fellow at Pembroke College at the University of Oxford. Welcome to all of you on the show. Let me start with Elizabeth in the UK. Is the coalition now falling apart?
It's difficult how it can be perceived as not falling apart at this point. I think the latest airstrikes by the United Arab Emirates are a step change in the clashes in the south. It may now be time to start calling them a war, because there are only one of three scenarios that could have happened. Either the UAE did not consult Saudi about these strikes, and that means the coalition's falling apart, or the UAE did consult Saudi, and Saudi gave it the go-ahead, which means that Saudi and the Yemen government are falling apart. And the third possibility is that the UAE consulted Saudi and Saudi refused, in which case the coalition's falling apart. So, UAE may have acted unilaterally, but even if it didn't, it means the coalition's falling apart.
All right. Well, Elizabeth has opened for us, I guess, three beautifully summed up scenarios there. Hassan, which one do you think is most likely? Were the Saudis on board with this or cut out of this latest UAE action?
Well, I think, from the get-go, the Saudis have a different agenda in Yemen, and obviously the Saudis are not on board. But at the same time, I think Abu Dhabi is blackmailing Saudi Arabia because they know that Riyadh needs them in the coalition for the appearance of having a coalition. And I think United Arab Emirates worked unilaterally in order to reinforce its whatever they have in southern Yemen. They want to affect a kind of a separation in Yemen, and they find in the Transitional Council as a tool to further the Emirati interest in Yemen, and that is obvious. So I'm not saying that the Riyadh is on board and like it agrees on everything, but Riyadh probably doesn't have what it takes to say no to Abu Dhabi right now, and amid a kind of international crisis, especially the geostrategic development with Iran.
If that's the case, let me jump in, Hassan.
Abu Dhabi more than
if that's the case, what does that mean ultimately in terms of UAE-Saudi coordination? Will the UAE be ejected from this coalition, as the Hadi government at one point was calling for, or will the Saudis have to look the other way and try and keep Abu Dhabi on board?
I think for the time being, there is no coalition. We talk about coalition, but in the coalition that we knew at the very beginning, that was the one that fighting the Houthi. They're not fighting the Houthi. Abu Dhabi is fighting its own war and for its own interests. So if we talk about the coalition, the one that we know, the Saudi-led coalition or the Arab coalition, is no longer there. Now it's only United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, and we can see now there's a kind of a clash between their own interests now. When Saudi Arabia is going to eject United Arab Emirates, I don't know. But I think it's an ultimate scenario that we probably see playing out soon.
All right, let's, if we could bring in Alkhadher. You're from, of course, the Southern Transitional Council, what's known as the STC. It's the action by Southern forces, which you're affiliated with, which has brought us to this point in Yemen. Do you agree that you are responsible now for the collapse of this coalition that's been fighting supposedly on the same side against the Houthis?
No, actually, I completely disagree with the introduction. I disagree with our guest speakers regarding the fall of the coalition. This is a collaborated coalition unit that goes through a operation or operates from an operation room in Riyadh through a rigorous process before approving any specific detailed airstrikes. So the UAE and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia are they are working together on every front, whether it is with the anti-Houthi front or the anti-extremism front.
Okay, but let me jump in as well now, if I may, Alkhadher. Explain this to me. According to what you're describing then, the Saudis would have known that the UAE is about to launch airstrikes against, what the UAE is calling terrorists, but in fact, what we're hearing from the Hadi government is these are strikes on the Yemeni government. If that's the case, you're saying Saudi Arabia is approved or is in line with airstrikes on the very government it's hosting in Riyadh. That doesn't make a lot of sense, does it?
Well, it's a little more complicated than that. Over the past 4 years or 4 years plus, the Saudi-led coalition has been working effortlessly to fight the Houthis, to fight extremism. Unfortunately, the legitimate government is actually incorporating some of these extremist factions, the radicals, through the Islah Party into the legitimate government. So the reactivating what they have, the Yemeni government is backpedaling by raid these counterterrorism in South Yemen specifically,
Okay, I'm
especially
really
after.
sorry to interrupt you again, Alkhadher, but I really want to distill what you're bringing to the show at this point. And what it sounds like you're saying right now is the STC, the Saudis and the Emiratis are lining up against the Yemeni government. Is that what you're telling viewers of this show? Because the Yemeni government includes, as you say, extremists.
That is incorrect. We're not against the Yemeni government as the government.
But you just said they're embedded with extremists from the Islah Party.
So correct. We're fighting the extremism that has been injected, or whether they have hijacked the Yemeni government. Unfortunately, while everybody, including the Saudi-led coalition, the STC, Southern Forces, have been fighting extremism, the internationally recognized government has regrouped them in and incorporated them into their units where that is not going to be accepted. So fighting extremism, whether they are part of the Yemeni government, is a regional security. And
right,
that is held high in priority.
Let me bring Elizabeth back into this. However you slice it and dice it, listening to what Alkhadher is saying there, it does sound like there is conflict, as you started out by saying, within the coalition at this point, with everyone pointing to the other one as harvesting the extremists.
Yes, there clearly is conflict. And I don't think it holds water to say that everyone's on board with this and that they're simply fighting extremism. These are very serious airstrikes. Many people were killed, and they were from the government forces. I think this highlights a problem of the whole rhetoric on the war on terror that was coined, obviously, initially by the United States, because it provides cover for what is ultimately a political agenda. Now, it's true that there has been an uptick in terrorist violence in Yemen in August. We've had, for example, more than double the monthly average of attacks by Al-Qaeda. And in fact, if you look at whom they've been targeting, then the targeting has been very strongly against the southern forces. But nonetheless, I think one does need to remain sceptical. For example, in Shabwa, there have been no terrorist attacks at all by either ISIS or Al-Qaeda so far this year. So to claim that one's fighting terrorism in Shabwa and not just political opposition, I think doesn't hold water.
All right, let's bring Hassan into the discussion. Is this really about the UAE's plans, as the Houthis allege, and many others actually in Yemen, to separate the south and the north of Yemen once again, so that if they draw down their troops, they still have a proxy to represent their interests there in the south?
I think it boils down to one thing, that the United Arab Emirates have one interest, and it's to protect and support the secessionists. And the talk about extremism is a kind of pretext. We know that Islah Party is Muslim Brotherhood, and it's not classified as extremist by anyone other than the United Arab Emirates. And the United Arab Emirates have actually classified Qatar as an extremist state. So do we believe that? We don't, of course. When President Hadi comes in public and condemns the United Arab Emirates, he is not part of the Islah Party. He is not part of those extremists, as he said. He represents the legitimacy. He represents the probably the address for the Yemeni, that the United Arab Emirates committed itself to bring him back to Sana'a. And now, what happened in the past, the United Arab Emirates even prevented him from visiting Aden. So this is a well-known story that the United Arab Emirates have its own
okay, ultimately, is the design to have the South break away, Hassan?
For their own economic interest? Yes, of course. I think this is the ultimate end for the United Arab Emirates.
Why?
Abu Dhabi doesn't care or even doesn't give attention to the Houthi. Why? Because for economic reasons, and because they want to use Aden for Dubai ports, etc. So we know this is a well-known story. And so by dividing Yemen into two Yemen, it would be easier for them to control it and to control the southern part of Yemen.
All right, let me bring Alkhadher into this again. A divided Yemen is ultimately where the resurgence of the STC forces are taking the country. How do you respond to that?
Well, first of all, let's see how did the STC come about? Where these calls have came? How long have these calls been on the ground? The STC. We got to go backtrack a little. After '94, this was an all-out occupation. 2007 came out a southern movement. In 2015, there was a southern resistance. The southern resistance gave birth to the southern forces, and so the STC came about. These separatist calls or the secessionist calls have been for over 2 decades. This is not a recent call that UAE
my question
has
was
recently
a resurgence
activated,
of this.
but
with the UAE
correct,
supporting this,
independence.
I'd like you to address the concern that ultimately the country will be divided, and one in which southern forces really are a front for UAE interests. There is that allegation that Hassan pointed out, in which the UAE wants to maintain its interest in some of the ports of Yemen, particularly in the south.
That is incorrect. That is incorrect because the Southern Transitional Council has been very efficient, working directly with the Saudi-led coalition as far as the anti-extremism fronts and the anti-Houthi fronts. Now, these are both regional security matters. These are not for South Yemen alone. This is also for North Yemen and for the entire region. There's over 25,000 southern troops in the northern provinces or governorates that are fighting in Saada, Ta'ez, Dali', and other governorates. This is not just because the Saudi-led coalition couldn't find any genuine resistance on the ground besides these southern forces. This is what activated the entire support to the Southern Transitional Council and their forces.
All right, I can see Elizabeth is shaking her head. I think you want to get in on this. Go ahead.
I think there's a lot of truth to what the STC spokesman says in terms of long-term grievances that go back decades. But these were reactivated by the formation of the Southern Transition Council, which was backed by the United Arab Emirates. And we can see where this is heading. It's not good enough to say that the Southerners support the coalition when they are calling back their troops from the very fronts that were just mentioned in the north of Yemen to say, come and defend us, stop fighting the Houthis, come and defend us against the Northerners. Even yesterday, there was a tweet by the deputy of the Southern Transitional Council, Hani bin Break, where he mentioned all 7, if you include Socotra, governorates of the south and said, we will not give an inch. Now, that doesn't sound like coalition talk. That sounds like separatist talk.
Elizabeth, if we connect the dots a little bit, we had the announcement, the UAE made the announcement it was drawing down its troops. Kind of around the same time we had all those attacks going on, UAE and Saudi oil interests in the Gulf, which were blamed on Iran. And now we have this battle going on in Aden. If you connect the dots, do you read through this, the UAE sending a message that it wants perhaps to be closer or not so much, at least in conflict with Iranian interests, and just wants to carve out some interest for itself in the south of Yemen?
I think we should see this in the broader context, which is that the United Arab Emirates has now for several years been recruiting troops across the south of Yemen that were not directly answerable to the Yemeni government of President Hadi. So it's very clear that there was some purpose to these troops that may have extended beyond fighting terrorism. After all, the number of terrorist attacks in Shabwa, as I mentioned, is very few. And in fact, when the major counterterrorism operations began there had only been 1 that year so far. So it was less than 1%. But the resources of Yemen and of Shabwa are heavily based in oil and gas. And so it's very difficult not to see an ultimate commercial and political agenda behind this.
Why is Saudi Arabia being relatively silent on this so far, do you think, Hassan? Is it just down to the fact that, well, they want to try and keep Abu Dhabi on board in the coalition?
Well, I think this is the only thing that I can think of right now, because we know that Hani bin Break is the deputy of the CTC he actually threatened Saudi Arabia, and he reminded them that the Houthis have been fighting them for 4 years, and his forces can do the same. So by claiming that this council is working in harmony with Saudi Arabia, I think this is not substantiated with any hard evidence, because the statements coming from the council is actually on the contrary.
All right, Hassan, what about the United Nations? Should we expect any UN action over the events going on in Aden and the apparent crumbling of this coalition?
Well, unfortunately, the United Nations has been doing nothing other than, expressing its concerns about what is happening. But on the ground, I think the United Arab Emirates is the strongest part in Aden, and it's going to decide matters probably in days to come. But doesn't mean that Emirate would win the war in Yemen. Emirate would actually be defeated at the end of the day, because the Yemeni people would rise up against it. Now we can witness something new. That for the first time that we see that the Yemenis themselves are saying that Abu Dhabi is an occupying force. So we've never heard such a thing before. And I think this is a new development and the level of the conscience of the people. And this could materialize to different things or translate into probably a kind of action that would hurt United Arab Emirates.
I want to take that point briefly to Alkhadher in 60 seconds. If I may, Alkhadher, the calls from some Yemenis to see the UAE as an occupying force. What's your take on that as the STC?
Well, that's the international recognized government is trying to push all their blame, all their faults or failures onto someone else, as usual.
But a minute ago, you just said that you're still in the coalition with them, didn't you? And you're only targeting extremists. So which is it?
The Southern Transitional Council is definitely working with the Saudi-led coalition, fighting extremism and fighting...
Well, the coalition is supposed to be supporting the Hadi government. Do you ultimately want the Hadi government to rule over Yemen or not?
The Hadi government is being supported by the Saudi-led coalition, but you have to understand also that the Hadi government is incompetent. It has failed on the economic level, on the basic services level, on the liberated areas where there is no Houthis.
So do you want to see it fall?
Any services. They have not been able to. They have failed also militarily. They have accumulated 250,000 troops in Ma'rib. If you let me just finish this point, the 250,000 troops in Ma'rib that have not moved to less than an hour drive away or 50 kilometers, but have been very mobile when it came to the southern.
Okay, I understand your concerns. My question, though, very briefly, do you want to see, does the STC want to see the Hadi government rule over Yemen or not?
Well, the STC and the southern it actually stands by the popular will. That's where it gains its strength. The southern people have rights. This is not, we're not subhuman.
All right. No one has suggested that. We've got 60 seconds left now.
This is a human right for
Understood. You haven't really answered that question. We'll leave it to the viewers to draw whatever conclusion from that. If I can give the last 6 seconds to Elizabeth. Are we seeing a situation emerge, Elizabeth, where perhaps the Houthis and Hadis have increasingly something in common?
I think it's very difficult for us to see anyone as having anything in common in Yemen, because the loyalties are so fluid. What is true, though, is I think the southern secessionist horse has bolted, and it's not going to be feasible to have their entire withdrawal before peace talks can take place in Jeddah. So something needs to change in the Hadi government.
All right, I'm afraid we are out of time, so let's thank our guests. It's been a really good discussion. Alkhadher Sulaiman, Hassan Barari and Elizabeth Kendall. And thank you too for watching this show. As always, you can see the show again anytime if you head over to our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and the whole team here. For now, it's goodbye.